good to be together this morning. Grateful for the opportunity to open up God's Word and gain some wisdom and instruction, and kind of turning a different direction from where we were the past few Sundays. We're looking at examples of the direction that would help us and guide us to be the kind of men and women and guiding those who are under our care to be the kind of people that God would be pleased with and that God can use and to represent Him and His character in the kingdom. We want to look at maybe some characters that we find also in Scripture to give us kind of an idea of things that would be good for us to learn as cautionary tales, cautionary lessons of just certainly the direction men and women can go without God's guidance and that wisdom that we have from Scripture. And whenever I look at Samson, I can't help but think of the cautionary kind of parable tale of Beauty and the Beast. The idea that you have two kinds of men that were kind of fighting over the love of a young lady, and you have one who maybe on the exterior was not all that appealing, but you get to know them on the inside and find out, what wonderful qualities that this individual had if they just kind of look past what was on the exterior. And then you have Gaston. You have the smooth, appealing individual, someone maybe has all the outward characteristics that would be very appealing and very enticing, very capable, very strong, very sure of himself. But that's the key, very too sure of himself. Too sure of himself. And that's really what we see in Samson. Samson was a man who certainly, he had a lot of characteristics. And what's amazing is that God gave him these characteristics. God gave him these traits, but God wanted him to use them to His glory. And without God's guidance, without proper help and instruction, we can often find ourselves in that same pitfall of being almost too sure of our own abilities, too sure of the things that God has blessed us with, but feeling that we don't need guidance, we don't need instruction, and that can be very, very dangerous. And so whenever I think about Samson, I just can't help it. But I think about, Gaston, just singing all those traits about himself and just so sure of himself and kind of almost clueless why someone like Belle wouldn't want to be with him. And, and sometimes we can miss that as well. But we see Samson in Judges chapter 13 through 16. We're just going to look at several examples that show us, especially as men, maybe some pitfalls for us to avoid, and maybe for us as parents as we're guiding and helping our young men grow into the example that God would be pleased with. Maybe sometimes the question arises is where do people like Gaston, Samson, these kinds of overly confident to the point that it becomes a flaw? And that's sometimes kind of a fine line, because obviously we talked about with Joshua, said men are to be strong and courageous, right? We're supposed to be confident. We're supposed to be tapping into those strengths that God gave to us. I think that fine line is when we forget about the one who gave it to us. We start developing them on our own terms, in our own way. And that's what's really kind of sad, because sometimes the answer is sometimes even Samson men do come from God-fearing, conscientious parents. In other words, he had parents that were trying to teach him and were trying to help him. And yet Samson did kind of veer a little bit away from even the instruction and the guidance that his parents were giving him. And we see this in Judges chapter 13. Turn to Judges chapter 13. And perhaps maybe a helpful lesson for us as well, that as we are seeking to be a guide and a light for our children, maybe to notice some things that maybe Samson needed some extra help with to keep him from kind of going the direction he went. But we see in Judges chapter 13, he had godly parents. Judges chapter 13 verse 1 says, "Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and had borne no children. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold now, you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son. Now therefore be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing. For, behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, For the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, saying, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God, very awesome. And I did not ask him where he came from, nor did he tell me his name. But he said to me, behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and now you shall not drink wine or strong drink, nor eat any unclean thing, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. And notice it says in verse 8, then Manoah entreated the Lord and said, O Lord, please let the man of God whom you have sent come to us again, that he may teach us what to do for the boy who is to be born. I love this. In other words, these are conscientious parents. These are parents that they themselves had a sense of, well, let's be careful. In other words, not only was the first layer of instruction good enough, they wanted to be so cautious that they followed everything to its needed end. They said, let's listen to the instruction and have God and tell us exactly what to do. And that was their intent. Their intent was to raise him up and to be this example of holiness and reverence, and to be an instrument that God could use. But we find some things I think that we learn from the parents that I think are helpful for me as a parent. Some things that we begin to see in them. And one of the things that I think can be helpful is that even though these were God-fearing parents, they did tend to have some weaknesses at point, and tended to be maybe a little bit gullible. In other words, maybe it seems as if Samson was so persuasive and Samson was so good at kind of feeling so confident in the traits that he had. He was even able to help his parents kind of come along and support some things, or not really be too intrusive about things. And even they said, well, wait, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. And he was very good at kind of even helping defying the order of his parents. And his parents sometimes even had this sense of maybe not even, maybe taking more of a stronger stance that maybe would have helped him a little bit at times. But we see this one example in chapter 14. Turn over to Judges chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. It says, then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Now notice in verse 3, again, he has conscientious, God-fearing parents. And the parents right away recognize this is dangerous. This is something I really don't think you need to be doing, Samson. And they tell him this. In verse 3, then his father and his mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you go to take a wife from this uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she looks good to me. However, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, or he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Now, notice what it says in verse 5. It says, then Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and came as far as the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. It's interesting, at least right away, they kind of gave him a little bit of caution, kind of warned him, said, wait a minute, even as a Nazarite, we have this strict need to be very, very holy. That's what the Nazarite vow was, a kind of a strict sense of holiness, to being very conservative and mindful of that image that was supposed to be of being conscientious towards God's law. And it's interesting, even with the instruction from his parents, he was very good at convincing his parents that this really wouldn't be that bad. It couldn't hurt him that bad. It seems like that's the key. It seemed it was his biggest fault. Nothing bad's going to happen. He always get the pressure. He just kind of throws off any kind of warning, any kind of sense. It really doesn't apply to me. And it would be tempting because of how strong he was. And just the very image, the presence of him would have been very, very tempting to think, well, what could happen to him? What could really happen? And you kind of get the picture because the parents, even though they're trying to help him make good decisions, they're also going along with him and they're helping him find this woman. He says, oh, I need this woman. You're going to come and help me pick out this woman. And even though they tell him they don't think this is wise, they end up being convinced by Samson to do it. And so we see in verse 5, not only do they come down with him to pick out this woman who is going to be a very bad choice for him, but we see here Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came as far as the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that he tore him as one tears a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Kind of get the impression this is not the only time he never told his father and mother what he had done. Probably a lot of things he didn't tell his mother and father what he had done. But this is one interesting, one particular time he doesn't tell his mother and father what he did. And there's a reason he doesn't tell them. Because as a Nazirite, he needs to be observing the laws of cleanliness. Well, there were passages of Scripture that said that animals that walked on their paws were unclean. Animals that walked on their paws were unclean. And not only does Samson become unclean by kind of contact with this, but then he scoops honey out of the carcass and he offers it to his mom and dad. And mom and dad don't seem to be interested or really concerned about where it came from. It was very trusting. Almost too trusting, because again, I think that mindset was that I think he was very good at convincing his parents. It was seriously, I mean, nothing bad's going to happen. I mean, seriously, I'm this image of strength and might, and just kind of tended to kind of be dismissive of real sense of warning or caution. But we look at a couple passages. One is over in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7. And interesting things that really never came up or don't seem to be too alarming. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 3 says, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. And the most his parents said was, I don't know if this is going to be a good idea. Aren't there other women that would be better? And then, but again, Samson's very convincing to kind of dismiss that warning. Not only that, but Deuteronomy chapter 14. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 14 in verse 5. Deuteronomy chapter 14, beginning in verse 5, it says, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep, any animal that divides the hoof and has the hoof split in two, and choose the cut among the animals that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those that divide the hoof in two, the camel, the rabbit, and the shepherd, for though they chew the cud, they do not divide the hoof, they are unclean to you. And so there was all these laws about uncleanness. But going over to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11. And note verse 27. In addition to these, or this description, it says, also whatever walks on its paws among all the creatures that walk on all fours are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses become unclean until evening. And the one who picks up their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. They are unclean to you. And not only that, but not only would he become unclean, but his parents become unclean. Numbers chapter 19. And I'd have no doubt that Samson knew these things. At early he was like, whatever. Nothing's going to happen. Here, Mom, Dad, I found some honey. Where'd it come from? They don't seem to be too interested. Again, I think they were very trusting. We could think he was very good at just that he convinced himself and all that, but probably even those around him. Seriously, it's not that big a deal. These things aren't that serious. It's not something to be all alarmed about. But Numbers chapter 19, verse 20. Notice what it says in Numbers chapter 19, verse 20. It says, but the man who is unclean and does not purify himself from uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, because he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. the water for impurity has not been sprinkled on him, he is unclean, so it shall be a perpetual state for them. And he who sprinkles the water for impurity shall wash his clothes, and he who touches the water for impurity shall be unclean until evening. Furthermore, anything that the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person who touches it shall be unclean until evening. So not only was Samson kind of dismissive of these laws for himself, even really for his own parents. It just seemed that, I don't know if there's a sense of, well, God chose us, and God has blessed us, and God has privileged us, and so it just seemed like Samson just really didn't take these things to be very needed caution. There was no sense of caution whatsoever with how he behaved in this way. And again, you kind of see a little bit of this in just maybe being a little bit too trusting and a little bit too even having that same mindset because of how appealing and maybe just persuasive it was that Samson had this amazing strength. But this continues to be a snare for Samson, because what he continues to do is he continues to really ignore all sense of authority, and he just kind of lives above the rules. He kind of has his own sense of what rules apply to him and which ones don't. And he was very selective about this. Here he seems set apart to God through Nazirite vow, yet he is picking and choosing which restrictions he is going to obey. And he believes he's so strong that nothing can hurt him, not even potential sin. And doesn't really look at it that way, doesn't really seem to be caring that much about this vow that he's made. You have to go back there to Judges chapter 14. And we see there in verse 10. Judges 14 verse 10 says, Then his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for the young men customarily did this. When they saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. So again, this kind of sense that no one is really warning him. No one's telling Samson, I think you maybe think twice about this again. It kind of came up in the beginning, but this is Samson. What can happen? Certainly, it's not going to affect him. He's kind of above the law. He's above these restrictions. And really is a great lesson for us that if we get too overconfident, we become unnecessarily dismissive. And that's the warning of 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 through 13. We start thinking that we are too strong to fall, but where there's just too many strong qualities about us, or start thinking that because we see the blessings that God has given to us, because we're serving him in certain ways, that somehow now we don't need to be cautious, or we don't need to be sensitive to his warnings. That's a very dangerous place to be in. And one, I think, especially when we have talents and abilities and strengths, that it just gets too easy to have the proverbial kind of, it just goes to our head, so to speak. We just kind of just forget that we aren't as strong as what we think we are. And Samson really had a hard time with this. And we're going to see this continue. He overestimates his own cleverness, we see. He is so confident that not only can he come up with a riddle that no one's going to ever be able to solve, but he makes a hefty wager on it. He makes a hefty wager. He's confident no one's going to be able to figure this out. There's nobody as smart as I am, nobody who is clever. Nobody could even come up with the riddle I made, and there's no way anybody would even they pressed their head against it. Nobody could figure it out. And you know what's interesting about this is, to a certain degree, yes, he's right, but he underestimates, again, something that happens that works against him, because he just never considered that anybody would ever be able to figure it out. But he's so overconfident in his witty, puzzling riddle making, he's willing to place this hefty wager on it. We see this in chapter 14, verse 12. It says, Then Samson said to them, Let me now propound a riddle to you. If you will indeed tell it to me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. But if you are not unable to tell me, then you shall give me 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. What's interesting about this, Samson's not as, this is giving me kind of it's kind of a high, so to speak, or just kind of to risk losing money. No, in his mind, there is no risk. They're the ones at risk. There's no way he's going to lose. And he has got this super sense of ultra confidence. And so They said to him, propound your riddle that we may hear it. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. But they could not tell the riddle in 3 days. Then it came about on the 4th day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband so that he will tell us the riddle. And they are able to get to his wife. Tell us what the riddle is, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Is this not so? Samson's wife wept before him and said, you only hate me and you do not love me. You have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people and have not told it to me. And again, one of the reasons why God's wisdom is to be listened to is because one of the reasons he said, don't marry these foreign wives, they will be more loyal to their people than to God. They will be more loyal to the people they came from than to the God you're supposed to serve. And that's exactly what this woman did. She was more loyal to her own people than she was to her husband and his devotion to God. And so that's what happened. And so, but again, Samson never ever considered any of this. That's what makes it so amazing. We see his anger. His anger comes up because he believes that there's no way any of this ever should have happened. When really the truth is he should have been more conscientious and sensitive to understanding his own weaknesses. And yes, none of these things would have happened if he could have been more humble about that. But this is the trap he gets into. So his wife uses the loyalty card. You only hate me and you do not love me. And the reality is she's taking him for a ride. And she is using him. And he said to her, behold, I have not told it to my father or mother, so should I tell you? However, she wept before him 7 days while their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her because she pressed him so hard. And why does he tell her? Nothing bad. I'm really confident. No, even if I probably shouldn't tell anybody. In fact, he didn't tell anybody. But even when he tries to be cautious, he's like, why am I cautious? What do I need to be cautious for? What's the worst that could happen is kind of his mentality. So he tells her. She then told the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. What's kind of odd about that is that even though he's right about the accusation, it's true, they wouldn't have found out the riddle if they hadn't talked to his wife. But think about this. He assumed there is no way this riddle could be solved unless you had help from my wife. That's the only possible way this could have ever gone down. There's no way you could have figured it out, is what he was saying. Did you catch that? I know there's no one who's quite as clever as I am. There's no way anybody would ever be able to match my intellect and my wit. And that's essentially what he was saying. And the only way you ever would have figured this out is because, you haven't talked to my wife. And again, no accountability, no responsibility. He blames other people. And again, you have to, it's almost it is kind of comical how he decides to pay for the debt. He doesn't pay for it out of his own pocket. He goes and steals it from a bunch of other people and makes them pay for it. He's not paying, because in his mind, why should I? Because I wasn't supposed to lose. To catch that? Why should I pay? I wasn't supposed to lose. Then we get in that game, we say, hey, who wants to play Monopoly? And then all of a sudden, when I'm out of money, I'm throwing the game in the air because I wanted to play because I was supposed to win. I wouldn't have played with you unless I thought you were a sucker and you would have lost. That's kind of Samson's. His whole mentality is that. How dare you actually figure this out? How dare you actually beat me? And so that's what he does. So notice what it says. It says in verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of them and took their spoil and gave the changes of clothes to those who told the riddle. And his anger burned. And he went up to his father's house, but Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his friend. So in other words, again, when he gets to these moments, he tends to be very self-centered and kind of forgets about others. They're kind of involved in this, and he's just so focused and so angered because no one was supposed to beat me. It wasn't set up that way. In his mind, he had all the tools for success. Therefore, I don't need to be careful. I don't need to be cautious because I'm going to win, is what his thought process was. And that's so dangerous. And it's hard to find that balance. Because again, we're supposed to, yes, be strong, be courageous, not be timid. But we've had to have that sensitivity of realizing where all of our strength comes from and letting God direct us in the process. And letting God let us be mindful of the warnings when we need to listen to them. And Samson just had such a hard time doing that. Not only this, but we see it progress through his life. Not only did he have this overconfidence about his own abilities and his wit, it led to him taking very, very foolish risks. Very foolish risks. Here's a man, he's visiting a prostitute. We find in chapter 16, verse 1. Going and doing things that, again, in his mind, why would you? You ever search through people like, why would you do that? Or why would you take this danger and get a lot of times the mind says, well, I just didn't think anything was going to happen. Just never considered that anything bad would happen. And that's kind of where Samson's mind is. So in chapter 16, verse 1, now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And when it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they kept silent all night, saying, let us wait until the morning light, then we will kill him. Now Samson lay until midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the city gate, and the two posts, and pulled them up along with the bars. Then he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. So again, he's his own worst enemy. In other words, his strength becomes his own weakness. Isn't that odd? His strength is his weakness because he assumes, even if something bad happens, my strength can save me. So what? If I make a bunch of people upset at me and I make poor choices, I can always take the doors of the city and I'll show them who's boss. And I'll take care of it. I'll fix it. And he continues to be very good at it until it catches up with him. And it's because of a very foolish risk. He gives away the secret to his strength. A very foolish thing to do. But why would he do it? I can fix it. And he did. He thought, it's all right. I'll be able to make it right. Only this time it was, he couldn't overcome it. And so we see this in Judges chapter 16, there in verse 4. It says, after this it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, then I will become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in wait in an inner room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of tow snaps when it touches fire, so his strength was not discovered. I don't know about you, this is the part that always kind of, I guess it puzzles me, but then again, when you see his history, it doesn't puzzle you. It puzzles me because I'm like, Samson, you cannot trust this woman. Clearly, you cannot give any secret elements of your life and trust that she's going to do anything positive with it. But he over and over again continues to play this game. It's a game to him. It was a game of, well, go ahead and try to surprise me with a bunch of people waiting to kill me, and nothing's going to happen. But the fact that he never decides to get out of the situation, or at least to protect himself. But notice it says, Delilah said to Samson, behold, you've deceived me and told me lies. Now please tell me how you may be bound. He said to her, if they bind me tightly with new robes, which have not been used, then I will become weak and be like any other man. So Delilah took new robes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, for the men were lying in wait in the inner room. But he snapped the ropes from his arms like a thread. And again, over and over and over it goes, until in verse 15. It says, then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have deceived me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength is. It came about when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him that his soul was annoyed to death. So he told her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. The interesting thing about this, he says it so flippantly, he doesn't give much thought to it, because the idea is, I'm just tired of you bothering me. I just want you to quit bringing it up. So zero thought goes into, what did I just do, or should I do this? It was just a sense of, I'm just tired of the game, and it's kind of annoying at this point. It was kind of this mindset. He said she just kind of got to the point that I just need to just tell you straight out. So, verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all that is in his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands, and she made him sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his hair. Then she began to afflict him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. Never, ever occurred to him. The thought that I could be in any danger, it just wasn't there. And sadly, he was not able to free himself. It says, but he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. And that tends to be a key statement. When we become overconfident, not only do we not even aware when God is with us, we're not aware when he's left us. That's a very vulnerable place to be in. When you aren't aware of the signs that God is with you, I won't even know it when he's left me. And I will have no reason to fear, and that's why we need to cultivate this sense of caution. Even though we're utilizing, yes, the abilities God has given us, our own strength, and initiating it, we need to have a sense of humility about recognizing where those things come from and trusting that, yes, God is needed in this process, and we need to recognize where his strength is and when he leaves and when he's not supporting us. And he just didn't know. Never occurred to him. And yes, this will eventually catch up to us. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. I have a very humbling statement about some of this. Ecclesiastes 6 verse 10 says, whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. Which sometimes we just assume that we can figure out the game. And if we figure the game out enough, we can play by our own rules and we can manipulate it enough. And he says, don't count on it. Don't count on it. Somewhere along the line, we're going to slip up and we're going to be left being beaten by the very game we think we're trying to win. And we're trying to play a game against who's going to direct my life. And we're fighting against God. Remember what Gamaliel said? If you think you're going to fight against God and win, he said, it will fall apart. Anytime you try to work against God, it will destroy itself. It will come to nothing. And we may be deceived for a certain while thinking we can win. But eventually, sadly, it will come upon us. And sadly, some of the things he thought that everything was even about him, and his refusal to accept any responsibility or guilt. Again, he constantly felt that he was kind of entitled to behave the way that he did. And even his final act of faith, it's kind of sad because it was a prayer revolving solely around him. He's simply just so angry that the Philistines got the best of him. And he said, one last time, let me avenge my enemies. But that was the key. He never understood these weren't his enemies. These were God's enemies. These were God's people's enemies. Samson made it all about him. He became so wrapped up in a personal vendetta about proving himself against those that he never took a selfless state of saying, maybe I need to look at how God needs to use me for other people. But nonetheless, he is coming around. He is learning to trust God. And that's the final point I want to rest on, is that thankfully, Samson did start to realize in his humbled state, I need to turn to God. He realized only by calling upon God was he able to use that strength and lean upon those pillars and knock everything down and defeat the Philistines. But one final passage, I want to read in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 32. It says, and what more shall I say, for time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. What's interesting is Samson finds his name as an example of someone who had faith. And I love that because even with all the negative qualities we're looking at here this morning and all these cautionary tales, we can always come back. And hopefully, if nothing else, we learn the point that if hopefully we can see if we are on the wrong path, if we're too full of ourselves, if we're too overly confident, hopefully we can realize I need to start putting my faith in God, as Samson was able to do. And hopefully, before it's too late, put our faith in our need to submit to him, to make corrections in our life if necessary, and ultimately to obey him as best we possibly can and let him use us as he sees fit. One final point here as we wrap our lesson up, but I always found it kind of interesting that Samson died in strength, kind of in this position. He stretched out his arms, and as he pushed the pillars down, he died in this kind of state. And in so many ways, I just can't help but picture, Jesus, our Savior, obviously much more humble than what Samson was, but yet full of strength, dying in humility with his arms stretched out as he was nailed to a cross. And he died that we might overcome our enemies, the devil and all of his angels and all of that sin does to rip us away from God. Jesus has done everything possible to save us from that demise. Won't you turn in faith and submit to Christ and obey the gospel? Obedient to confess that Jesus is Christ, repenting of sin and being buried in water for baptism. And if you have already done that but need to come back to him, again, Samson's a great example. It's never too late. Samson recognized, I need to trust God. If it's time for you also to do that, we're here to help assist you to put your faith in God and turn to him and realize you need to trust him with your life and be faithful. Won't you come to the front as we stand and sing this psalm of encouragement? Won't you come and obey the gospel and be right with God?